Oh, hi, my name is Eric Jamois. Thank you for joining me in this ADMET Predictor interactive tutorial dedicated to deployment and licensing. So the topic for today is going to be on the use and sharing of licenses. It is important to understand what license features you will be using and also to scale these licenses to your needs. So we're going to see the different mechanisms that are available to you in terms of checking in and checking out licenses using the software. So I have 5 sessions of ADMET Predictor open here. And if we want to see which licenses have been checked out, we simply go under Help and look for the View License Status option. And if you do this, you will realize that actually opening an ADMET Predictor session actually does not consume any licenses. So in this license status box, you have different kinds of information. This lists the different license features that are relevant to ADMET Predictor. Everything that starts with AP underscore be relevant to ADMET Predictor. The total is the total number of users that are licensed. The available column represent what is available to you depending on what you're already using or what someone else on the network, if you have a network license, what someone else on the network may be using. The fourth column is the expiration date. That can be important, but right now we're going to focus on the use of these license features. So again, right now, using simply opening an ADMET Predictor session does not consume any licenses. And actually, most of the data analysis tools in ADMET Predictor do not consume any licenses. Anything like opening files, displaying histograms, and various operations with data do not typically use any licenses. So we can open a file here. We're going to open this set of 10,560 compounds, which is again a set of molecules coming from enamine known as their diversity set. So we're going to open this with the IDs of the compounds being in the specified field. And if we go back to license status, as I said, that process of opening a file does not consume anything. And the fact that if you have say you have a one user concurrent license of ADMET Predictor for a couple of modules, this actually allows you to open an unlimited number of ADMET Predictor sessions. It's a little bit unusual in the software world in the sense that usually when you have a one user concurrent license, typically means that only one person at a time can use the software. In the context of ADMET Predictor, it is different because what we license is related to specific tasks within the software. So for example, the calculation of physicochemical properties or metabolism properties. Again, these refer to property calculations or the fact of, say, building models using ADMET Modeler. That's also a licensed task. What we just performed in terms of just loading a data set is not per se a licensed task. It's part of the general features of the software. And again, that does not consume any licenses. So that potentially makes ADMET Predictor a very economical solution for deployment of the software to a group. The other thing I wanted to say is that there are different mechanisms by which ADMET Predictor may be deployed. So for example, here we're using the software through the graphical user interface. This is the majority of our users make this sort of interactive use of the application, but we also have a certain number of users using command line. and that uses the same pool of licenses as is used with the graphical user interface. Likewise, we also have users for ADMET Predictor enabling the software through NIME or pipeline pilot nodes. Again, the same pool of licenses can be used for any of these three modes of deployment. Okay, so now we have 5 sessions of ADMET Predictor that are open, and one thing I want to show you is that we're going to go through a calculation of ADMET properties, and under File Preferences, you can set the number of threads that the calculation will use. So under the Advanced tab, you can set the maximum number of threads, the maximum number of processors, same thing in this case, to use for computations. I have elected to use 7. My laptop has 8 logical cores, so I could use up to 8, but I've decided conservatively to use 7 and to retain 1 logical core for housekeeping of other tasks on my machine. So anyway, that is the way to set up. For me here, you can set up differently in your environment if you so desire. Now, we're going to set up a calculation of ADMET properties using these parameters. If you go to Data and calculate ADMET properties, that will open this panel. You can also trigger it through this ADMET properties icon, and depending on which modules you have enabled, again through your licenses, some of these options may be grayed out. Like for example here, I do not have any user models, and therefore that option is grayed out. If you didn't have, say, the toxicity module, for example, then toxicity would be grayed out. So since I have all the licenses available, we can leave all of these enabled, and then the calculation will proceed with all these for all of these properties. Now, what we're going to do is proceed to the calculations and at the same time monitor what the license status becomes. So let's go ahead and launch this calculation. So as you can see, it proceeds somewhat quickly. We're probably going at the rate of close to 200 compounds per second. So we better rush to this panel here, for example, if we want to see, likewise under help, what the license status is. So let's go under view license status like we've done before. And what you will notice is that for the properties that we're calculating, we have checked out a certain number of license features. So since we're including metabolism in as part of the properties, then we have a metabolism license that is checked out. There are only 2 that remain available out of the total of 3 that we're licensing. Likewise, for PhysChem properties, we're also calculating these. We only have 2 that remain available out of the 3, so we're consuming 1. Again, performing this calculation on the 7 threads only uses 1 license, which is actually pretty nice. This license status panel also shows you who is using this functionality. So when you select that feature that is being used, if it's an unused feature, then obviously nobody's using. But if you select something that is currently being used, then it'll show that this individual here, Ijamoa, which happens to be me, just in a different session, is using this license feature. Okay, and so that's all fine. Now let's go back to our calculation to see what the status is, and it looks like the calculation is completed, so the calculation is finished. Now, again, going back to view license status, what do we see? Well, we see that actually the license features are still checked out, and the natural question may be, why is it so? Why were they not returned back to the pool when the calculation finished? The reason for that is the software doesn't really know what your intentions are in terms of calculations. We have users who plan their work, and they have a whole series of SDF files that they want to submit one after the other. And if we were to relinquish the license back to the pool, and then someone else on the network takes this license, and then it's no longer available to them, so they'd be kind of stuck and having to wait that this person on the network finishes before they can resume their work. So we've decided that the license would remain checked out until the original user decides to put them back in the pool. And that's very easy to do in this view license status panel. If you want to put the licenses back in the pool, simply go into viewer mode, okay? And that will put everything back in. Everything that you're using will be put back in. Of course, not what other people are using. That's something they would need to do on their end. But you see now that we have 3 out of 3. All our licenses have been checked in. So this is the first way that you can manage your licenses. And it's also one way that you can calculate properties. In ADMET Predictor, there's actually well, I should say in the ADMET Predictor environment, there's actually a second way that you can calculate properties, and that is through the MetChem Designer interface. You can find this on this icon here, MetChem Designer, which is this aldehyde here. If you click on this icon, you will see that again, you can also trigger calculations from here. Let's load a set of files. Calculation of properties in MetChem Designer is limited to 100 compounds. However, I mean, if you try to select a file which contains more than 100 compounds, like this one contains over 10,000, it will not complain, but it will only load the first 100. So as I said, you can trigger the calculation of properties through this interface. You have access through this settings options. If you go to the ADMET tab, you will find a similar selection of properties that you can calculate. These are the same that are licensed on the ADMET Predictor sides. ADMET Predictor side. So if you're, say, licensing our PhysChem properties module and metabolism module, then only these two will show up in the MetChem Designer interface as well. Now, if we want to calculate ADMET properties here, simply push this ADMET properties button here. Some of the structures contain multiple components. This is something I did not correct in the file. For the purpose of this example, it doesn't really matter, so we're just going to proceed with this. It's not an issue. And the calculation, again, proceeds pretty quickly and shows you the properties. Notice that the data is organized a little bit differently, that we now have the compounds as columns and the properties in rows, whereas in the ADMET Predictor interface, it was the reverse. We had the compounds in rows and the attributes in columns. So, but one thing I wanted to draw your attention to in terms of licenses is that the license that was used to perform this property calculation is actually different from the licenses we used previously in ADMET Predictor. And for the sake of completeness here, the license that's used is actually an MD underscore ADMET Predictor license. The software will check that you have these that you have the license for the properties that you selected. So if you're selecting from the MetChem Designer interface, if you're selecting PhysChem properties, say, and metabolism properties, it will check that you have these as valid licenses, but it will not check the feature out. Again, it just looks to see that you have them, but it doesn't check them out. So even though you're doing these calculations through the MetChem designer interface, they remain available potentially to another user for calculations in ADMET Predictor. That is actually quite worth noting. If, for example, you're doing calculations on a few handful of compounds, but you have another colleague who wants to do an extensive set of calculations potentially involving large sets of compounds, these two calculations are not going to be interfering with each other. Okay, so there was one last thing I wanted to share with you having to do with metabolism predictions. Now, there are two ways that you can trigger the prediction of metabolites. The first one is through the ADMET Predictor interface, and that is found under the data pull down, predict metabolites. And you have the choice between CPOX, UGT, and esterase metabolism. If you predict metabolites that way, you will be using, if we go back to our view license status panel that we've used before, you will be using an AP_metabolism license feature. Okay. Now, the second way that you can trigger the prediction of metabolites is through the MetChem designer interface, and that is done by just double-clicking on this compound to open a MetChem designer window. Now, what I like to do is to bring the compound in the center of the window, and that gives us a little bit more real estate to work with. And you can trigger the prediction of metabolites using this Generate Metabolites button here. And you have, again, the choice between CPOX, UGT, and esterase metabolism. So if we select CPOX, then the software will generate likely metabolites for this compound. Now, you can actually control the behavior of this metabolite generation through this change settings wheel. And if you go under the metabolism tab, you can turn on and off different isozymes of cytochrome P450 as well as UGT, and you also have access to other functions. Now, coming back to the licensing aspects, if we go over here to our usual view license status panel, you will see that we have not used any AP_metabolism licenses. We actually have used an ADMET Predictor, a MetChem designer ADMET Predictor license. So MD_ADMET Predictor is the license that we've used. Now, you're going to ask me, well, if we used it, how come you still have 3 available out of the 3 that you license? Well, that's a good question. The reason is we did check out one of these MD_ADMET Predictor license features when we performed the metabolism predictions. It is just so that it was returned back to the pool when the calculation finished. Okay. Now, one thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the fact that although we did not use an ADMET Predictor metabolism license, this license feature does need to be part of your license pool in order for the metabolism predictions to work, either from the ADMET Predictor environment or from the MetChem Designer environment. From the MetChem Designer environment, it will not check out the feature, but it will still verify that you do license, again, this feature as part of your license pool. Okay. The same would hold true if from these metabolites you wanted to calculate, say, a tox panel, and you could customize your ADMET properties to just do toxicity. You decided to perform tox property calculations. If we do this It's just warning me that one of the items is it's actually split in 2 molecules, which is fine. You can accept that. And likewise, upon performing this tox panel, it will use an MD underscore ADMET Predictor license and then put it back in the pool when it's done. So if we go to our MD underscore ADMET Predictor license feature, we still have 3 out of 3. It was only again taken in a very transient way while performing the property calculation. And likewise, we did not use an AP underscore toxicity license feature. We needed to have it as part of our package, so it needs to be licensed, but the license itself is not checked out at the time you do the calculation from the MedChem Designer interface. And that's actually potentially very interesting, because if you have one person performing large-scale calculations on hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of compounds from the ADMET Predictor interface, and a few people who want to perform calculations on a handful of compounds using MedChem Designer, then all of these individuals can work in parallel in the software. So again, a very useful way to sort of dual-headed way of performing tasks within the ADMET Predictor and MedChem Designer interfaces. So this concludes this tutorial. I hope this was useful and clarified certain aspects having to do with licensing. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you for your attention, and you have a great rest of the day. All right, bye now.